Greetings, I'm Michael Quinn Patton on April Fool's Day, here to celebrate the role of evaluators as jesters, speaking truth to power. In medieval times, that was the role of jesters. They did it through humor, through entertainment, through knowing what was going on, and finding ways to communicate to monarchs what was really going on when they surrounded themselves by people who just told them what they wanted to hear and didn't want to be in the position of giving the monarch what was sometimes bad news. That was the jester's role, to speak truth to power in a way that could be heard. Many indigenous and native traditions have clowns and tricksters who play the role of getting truth and understanding and wisdom to the people, whether it's a coyote or a raven or some other manifestation. These traditions include having some mechanism for opening people up, getting them to laugh, getting free of rigid preconceptions, and considering what wisdom there be from the trickster, from the clown, from the jester, reminding people that understanding sometimes comes from being upset, from reversals, from thinking differently, from surprise, from looking at the world in a different way. The trickster, in most native and indigenous traditions, plays a role of helping people be open and understanding the world, even if they have to be tricked to do so. And so tricksters, clowns, jesters are ways of reminding people of the importance of seeing the world in its reality and to be able to have a sense of humor about that to the extent possible. I've long used the jester in my workshops. Every utilization-focused evaluation begins by bringing together key stakeholders and primary intended users for a workshop to get shared understandings about what the evaluation is going to be about, what the questions are going to be, to co-create the evaluation process. I like to get introduced outside the room and then to come in, once I'm introduced, wearing this. I walk up in front of the group and say, I'm the evaluator. I'm the evaluator. The marvelous thing I found over the years is that they're really not that surprised. They're surprised that I'm going to be that honest about what they actually expect to go on. A lot of masking, not sure what's happening. And so the mask provides me an opportunity to begin a dialogue about what their expectations are about the evaluation, what their preconceptions are, what role I'm going to play, what role they're going to play, how we're going to get at what's behind the mask, what can be spoken, what can't be spoken, and to open up that kind of dialogue. So what I want to do in this video is share with you on April Fool's Day some of what I've come to find in 50 years of evaluation practice are areas where evaluation and evaluators still experience what I call foolishness. And these are my conceptions of what is foolish in evaluation and ways to be a jester without being a fool. Not everyone will agree, to be sure. You will have your own list. But this video is aimed at opening up that conversation to think about how can you be a jester effectively, communicate in ways that can be heard without coming across as foolish and without passing on some of the foolishness that has become embedded in evaluation over the years, at least from my perspective. My 10 ways to be an evaluation jester, but not an evaluation fool. Let's begin with a quote from William Shakespeare, reminding us that the fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. There are lots and lots of quotations about fools, about jesters, about clowns, about tricksters, and I'll draw on some of those as I share with you my own experience. Like this quote, "Foolproof systems do not take into account the ingenuity of fools." And so there is this tension, this paradox, this yin and yang between the jester as foolish and the jester as wise. And that's what we're going to draw on as we go through these 10 ways to be a jester as an evaluator without being a fool. The first of my top 10 list on evaluation wisdom to avoid being foolish is to know and acknowledge what is not and cannot be known. April Fool's Day is a great example of this. There's no definitive agreement about how April Fool's Day came about, what its origins are. There are hints of this in many different cultures, and going back to, in the West, to Roman times, to medieval times, but there's no moment, no definitive accounting for how April Fool's Day became recognized and with the traditions that it has, which do indeed vary around the world. And so it's a reminder that there are things that we cannot know and that evaluators need to be careful about not overpromising, overreaching about what is possible to know. Karl Popper, whose contributions to philosophy of science were monumental, argued that nothing could ultimately be proved, only disproved. Popper identified the natural tendency for people to overgeneralize and to speculate well beyond the data. Thus, the importance of carefully considering rival hypotheses and falsification possibilities. In that vein, an evaluator cannot definitively say that a program works. Findings are always conditional. The evidence will show that a program works or doesn't to a certain degree in ways that are conditional. The evidence will show that a program works or doesn't work under certain conditions, for specific people, in specific ways, with specific results in a particular context. An evaluation then can generate a preponderance of evidence about the degree in which a program or intervention works, but always conditional on context and on the situation in which the evaluation occurred. And so it's a matter of avoiding overgeneralizing and acknowledging that we can learn a great deal, but we can't be definitive. And that then brings us to the second jester wisdom, which is to be modest. Bertrand Russell famously said, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts." The American statistician in March of 2019 devoted an entire issue of that prestigious journal of the American Statistical Association to dealing with what they called moving to a world beyond p less than 0.05. And in the opening article by Wasserstein, Schremm, and Lazar, they lay out 4 principles for engaging with data. They said that researchers of any ilk may rarely advertise their personal modesty, yet the most successful ones cultivate a practice of being modest throughout their research by understanding and clearly expressing the limitations of their work. The nexus of openness and modesty is to report everything while at the same time not concluding anything from a single study with unwarranted certainty. Because of the strong desire to inform and be informed, there is a relentless demand to state results with certainty. Again, accept uncertainty and embrace variation in associations and effects, because they are always there, like it or not. Creel Weiss one of our great pioneers, wrote in an article for the American Journal of Evaluation, we should have a little more humility about what we promise our sponsors and clients. And Carol Weiss was a model of modesty and humility. So that brings us to the third admonition for evaluation wisdom, to avoid being foolish, and that is to avoid the language of best practices. Carol Weiss said in that same article, what works in a poverty neighborhood in Chicago may not stand a ghost of a chance in Appalachia. We need to understand the conditions under which programs succeed and the interior components that actually constitute the program in operation, as well as the criteria of effectiveness applied. We need to look across the program in different places, under different conditions, and with different features in an attempt to tease out the factors that matter. But even then, I have some skepticism about lessons learned, particularly in the presumptuous best practices mode. With the most elegant tools at our disposal, can we really confidently identify the elements that distinguish those program realizations that had good results from those that did not? The language of best practices is all over the place these days. Just this week, I've encountered 3 different instances of people claiming best practices, doing literature reviews for best practices, and yet there is an arrogance and a lack of sensitivity to context and an overreach, overgeneralization in the language of best practices. Think about what it means for something to be best. It means that all possibilities have been considered and everything except one possibility eliminated, and it means that context doesn't matter. But context always matters. And so we can say evidence-based practices, better practices, promising practices, bad practices, really bad practices, really, really, really bad practices. But the appropriate evaluation question is not the simplistic, does it work, which leads to a simplistic answer, but the more nuanced question, what works for whom, in what ways, under what conditions, with what results, in what context? A more modest and nuanced and contextual response that carries with it the notion that nothing works for everyone in all contexts in the same way. Context matters. Diverse contexts, diverse people, diverse perspectives, diverse processes, diverse outcomes. Best practices overrides all of that diversity. Context matters. Culture matters. If you find yourself saying best practices, slap yourself in the face. Wash your mouth out with soap. Stop saying it and suggest to others that it's not appropriate. That's part of being modest. It's part of the first admonition to know what we can and cannot say. We cannot identify best practices. We need to be modest and realize that we can't say that something works everywhere, but we can say what works where, with what conditions, for whom, with what results, in what context. That's a lot, and that's worth doing. Which brings us in to another admonition: don't stay statistically significant. In that same issue of the American Statistician, A World Beyond P less than 0.05, there is an eloquent discussion in which they outlaw the term statistically significant. The American Statistical Association statement on p-values and statistical significance in the past stopped just short of recommending that declarations of statistical significance be abandoned. They say in that 2009 journal, we now take that step here. We conclude, based on our review of the articles in this special issue and the broader literature, that it's time to stop using the term, quote, statistically significant, close quote, entirely. Nor should variants such as significantly different, or p less than 0.05, and non-significant survive, whether expressed in words, by asterisks in a table, or in some other way. Now, take this in seriously, because it's about knowing what we can say and not say, about being modest, and about not overgeneralizing. The second paragraph, regardless of whether it was ever useful, a declaration of, quote, statistical significance, close quote, has today become meaningless. They go on to say, statistical significance was never meant to imply scientific importance, and the confusion of the two was decried soon after its widespread use. Yet a full century later, the confusion persists. They go on to say, the initial slow speed of progress, that is, toward banning statistical significance, should not be discouraging. That is how all broad-based social movements move forward, and we should be playing the long game. But the ball is rolling downhill. The current generation is inspired and impatient to carry this forward. Now keep in mind, these are statisticians talking. Listen to this final conclusion. So let's do it. Let's move beyond, quote, statistically significant, close quote, even if upheaval and disruption are inevitable for the time being. It's worth it. In a world beyond p less than 0.05, by breaking free from the bonds of statistical significance, statistics in science and policy will become more significant than ever. While we're banning things, let's also ban this gold standard nonsense. Avoid fool's gold. The debate about randomized controls in evaluation and the gold standard question is not whether there are times when randomized controls are appropriate. There are. It's a helpful and powerful design, but it's not better than any other design. It doesn't belong at the top of a hierarchy. It is one option among many. Randomized control trials are difficult to do, and they have significant problems in conceptualization, in delivery, in implementation. The American Evaluation Association in 2003 took a formal position that randomized control trials are not the only studies capable of generating understandings of causality. They said that methods capable of demonstrating scientific rigor for at least a decade, evaluators have publicly debated newer inquiry methods and decided they were sufficiently rigorous. The issue was settled long ago. Actual practice and many published examples demonstrate that alternative and mixed methods are rigorous and scientific. In December of 2007, the European Evaluation Society adopted a statement on the importance of a methodologically diverse approach to impact evaluation, specifically with respect to development aid and development interventions. As context, the European Evaluation Society noted that this statement was prepared in response to strong pressure from some interests advocating for, quote, scientific, close quote, and, quote, rigorous, close quote, impact of development aid, where this is defined as primarily involving RCTs. This debate has the potential to influence the future direction of evaluation, not only with respect to development, but potentially in other areas as well. EES, however, deplores. Notice that verb, deplores. One perspective currently being advocated that the best or only rigorous and scientific way of doing so, that is attribution, is through randomized controlled trials. In contrast, the EES supports multi-method approaches to impact evaluation and does not consider any method such as RTTs as the first choice or the gold standard. And yet, there are still international organizations that are providing bonuses to senior management, to senior program staff for doing RCTs. They are continuing this talk about there being a gold standard, a hierarchy of evidence, instead of looking at what is really the platinum standard, methodological appropriateness, not methodological orthodoxy or rigidity. This gold standard nonsense means that every method other than randomized controlled trials is considered inferior. Nobody wants to do an inferior design. And so it's insidious, and it demeans other approaches that can be quite appropriate. Molière said, a learned fool is more a fool than an ignorant fool. They're very learned fools, well-educated, statistically and methodologically sophisticated, who are still talking about a gold standard hierarchy. Avoid being fooled by fool's gold. Rigor does not reside in methods. Rigor resides in rigorous thinking. Randomized controlled trials can and are poorly done. Other kind of methods are also poorly done. Rigorous thinking, rigorous implementation, rigorous matching, the platinum standard, using methods that are appropriate to the question. Eleanor Chalinsky, another one of our great pioneers, the head of the Government Accountability Office's Program Evaluation and Methodology Division, was very insightful in saying that what a strong evaluation is. She headed the GAO's Methodology Division between 1980 to 1994. She was the director of that unit. With 80 to 100 people in her unit, they conducted between 45 and 50 evaluations at any given time and produced 20 to 30 major evaluations annually. Eleanor commented on what constitutes a strong evaluation. She said that strong evaluations are those that employ methods of analysis that are appropriate to the question, support the answer with evidence, document the assumptions, procedures, and modes of analysis, and rule out the competing evidence. Strong studies pose questions clearly, address them appropriately, and draw inferences commensurate with the power of the design and the availability, validity, and reliability of the data. Strength should not be equated with complexity, nor should strength be equated with the degree of statistical manipulation of data. Neither infatuation with complexity nor statistical incantation makes an evaluation stronger. The strength of an evaluation is not defined by a particular method, including RCTs. Longitudinal, experimental, quasi-experimental, before and after, and case study evaluations can be either strong or weak. That is, the strength of an evaluation has to be judged within the context of the question, the time and cost constraints, the design, the technical adequacy of the data collection analysis, and the presentation of the findings. That is wisdom. That is what constitutes a strong evaluation, not some automatic assertion of a gold standard hierarchy. Go for the platinum standard. The challenge is matching the evaluation design to an evaluation's purpose, resources, and timeline to optimize use. That's what we should be about. Which then brings us to the sixth admonition, to be thoughtful, manifest and model evaluative thinking. Each of the preceding admonitions manifest being thoughtful, being clear about what we can say in an evaluation, being modest, avoiding the language of best practices, avoiding saying that something is statistically significant, avoiding asserting a gold standard design. These are all matters of being thoughtful. Evaluation rigor is built on rigorous evaluative thinking. And so in that same issue of the American Statistician, they generate 4 principles for analysis of any kind. They summarize their recommendation in 2 sentences totaling 7 words. These are their 4 principles. Accept uncertainty, be thoughtful, open, and modest. The abbreviation they call ATOM. Being thoughtful involves evaluative thinking. Evaluative thinking has received increasing attention in the last decade, and it is increasingly important because every evaluation that involves people in the evaluation in some way is not only producing findings, but is helping build the capacity of those involved to think evaluatively. And that carries over. Scriven famously said, "Bad is bad and good is good." And it's the job of evaluators to decide which is which. But Shakespeare in Hamlet said, "There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." It's not simply a matter of bringing evidence to bear. It's a matter of bringing values together with that evidence, being thoughtful about the result in order to reach a judgment of good or bad through careful thought, through deliberation. Evaluative thinking then has a long-term and enduring impact, the capacity to think evaluatively, to engage in astute situation analysis, to do needs assessment, to plan and design in accordance with situational analysis and needs assessment, to see the relationship between inputs and outputs of effort, to see unanticipated consequences and side effects. These are examples of evaluative thinking that when the capacity of programs, staff, and funders and commissioners of evaluation to think evaluatively will get better designs, better evaluations, more meaningful results, and better decision-making about interventions generally. Evaluative thinking integrates facts and values with critical thinking, with creative thinking, with inferential thinking. And so evaluation as a way of thinking becomes an important part of what we have to offer in our work. This cartoon shows our jester at the border being asked if he has anything to declare and says, yes, evaluation is a way of thinking. And his companion, Donkey, says they're only looking for findings. Evaluative thinking in the process of engaging in evaluation has become one of the important hallmarks of what we offer and what we do. And so our seventh evaluation wisdom to avoid being foolish is to connect theory and practice. The theory-practice connection is extremely critical. And yet a lot of practitioners haven't thought through exactly what the basis theoretically is of their work. I was just with a major practitioner, an esteemed, important practitioner in our field, where I was having this discussion with her, and she said, you know, I'm a practitioner, I don't need the theory, until we talked about theory as the uncovering and explaining why you engage in the practice that you engage in. The theory-practice connection is one of the areas that we need, each of us, to be able to develop and explore. Carol Weiss famously said, nothing is as practical as a good theory, and gave rise to developing theories of change for programs. The counter position that is said with some humor is that it works in practice, but does it work in theory? It works in practice, but does it work in theory? We need both practice and theory and have those things inform each other. And so I want to show you a short clip from Eleanor Chalimsky at the inaugural Eleanor Chalimsky Forum dedicated to integrating theory and practice. And listen to Eleanor herself express the importance of this.
My sense is that, you know, it's a great tool. It's indirect, it's modest, it's simple. You know, a little data here, a few documents there, and suddenly we contribute to the public debate in a serious way. So it's a great tool. But as far as we've gone, nationally and and internationally, it seems to me that we haven't confronted some of our internal processes the way we should, and we haven't, put theory in front of practice and practice in front of theory, and until we do that, it seems to me we've got a way to go. So I think we're doing something important today by doing that, and it seems to me that it's that blurred area between what you could call quantified reality and the reality of the real world that we've got to look at carefully. And so after that, theorists and practitioners they have valuable perspectives to bring together, and if we can do that, I think we'll get a solidity and a strength that we haven't had before.
And so that was Eleanor Chylimsky expressing the importance of the theory-practice interconnection. Let me give you an example of this with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. When the vaccine was being developed, the Moderna vaccine had a sample in an appropriate randomized control trial of 30,000 people divided between the vaccine group and the control group between July 27th and November 15th of 2020. In the vaccine group, there were 5 cases of COVID, none severe. In the control group, there were 90 cases of COVID, 11 severe. But these are really relatively small numbers, statistically significant because of the large sample. But to be thoughtful about this, the reason that the vaccine was approved was not simply these empirical results, but because they had been studying coronaviruses for some time, from SARS and other kinds of viruses, and they knew why the vaccine worked. They understood the mechanism of causality. It was that combination of theory, why does the vaccine work, and the empirical results about the degree to which it worked, the theory-practice intersection that made approval of the vaccine possible. 8th admonition, the importance of being adaptable. Early in the pandemic, I wrote a blog saying we're all developmental evaluators now. Programs were having to pivot and evaluators were having to pivot. And we've learned increasingly not to expect that we're going to have fixed and one time for all designs, but that in fact we need to be able to adapt and adjust to changing and turbulent conditions. That's what developmental evaluation is about. In working with adaptation, we need to be able to know what's happening. And that is, in fact, a nice example with April Fool's Day itself. In 1582, France switched from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, as called for by the Council of Trent in 1563. In the Julian calendar, as in the Hindu calendar, the new year began with the spring equinox around April 1. People who were slow to get the news or failed to recognize that the start of the new year with the new calendar had moved to January 1 and continued to celebrate the new year as April 1 became the butt of jokes and hoaxes and were called April Fools. In other words, they didn't adapt to the calendar change. I resonate with that origin story of April Fool's Day because it illustrates the importance of keeping up with how things change. In that instance, even the time can change. And I'm presenting this at a time when the U.S. Congress has just passed a law making daylight savings time permanent. So these kinds of changes can be changes in how we mark time, in the seasons, economic turbulence, viruses, pandemics, climate change, social justice uprisings, misinformation, political conflict, evaluation and evaluators have to be adaptable. And that adaptation means to include in evaluation designs and contracts language specifying that significant changes in context may lead to changes in evaluation, pay attention to trends and patterns that may affect the evaluation, and be open to change. Relevance is contextual. Use is contextual. And we have to be adaptable. Two more, then, that we're going to deal with. In utilization-focused evaluation, each of these themes that I've been talking about in the new edition, which just came out in 2022, emphasizes especially the importance of adaptability and anticipating and addressing evaluation anxiety through learning. Alice Walker, the great novelist, insightfully said, "People do not wish to appear foolish. To avoid the appearance of foolishness, they are willing to remain actually fools." The fear of failure is partly a fear of appearing foolish, both we as evaluators and the people we work with. There are two aspects of learning from failure that are important for evaluators. Stephanie Evergreen and I, for 5 years, between 2015 and 2019, at the annual conference of the American Evaluation Association, convened sessions on learning from failure. And they were well attended, and people shared their failures to help us learn from each other. We facilitate learning from failure among the stakeholders we work with, but we also have to walk the talk of learning from failure by doing it ourselves. And that's part of the reason I'm sharing my sense of the admonitions about how to be wise in evaluation, to be a jester without being foolish, and to stimulate that conversation. One of the things that I think is most tragic and disturbing is how few evaluators engage in evaluating their evaluations, following up to find out what worked and didn't work in an evaluation, what was used and not used, to work at getting better, to engage in reflective practice. You know the saying, being penny wise and pound foolish. A statement generated 500 years ago by one Robert Burton. Well, when we talk about use of our time, not just money, penny wise and pound foolish is not to spend time reflecting on our practice, not to spend time following up our evaluations to learn what went well and what didn't go well. I find that evaluators are always, under their terms of reference and contracts, rushing on to the next assignment and not building in reflection and follow-up time. That becomes really important to be able to learn from success and learn from failure. And finally, I conclude with the role of the jester, speaking truth to power. As a skilled jester, it's not enough just to lay out findings. It's not enough just to shout. But the jester's great skill is speaking truth in a way that can be heard and is heard, that leads to use. Speaking truth to power, then, means developing the capacity to engage with intended users and to having involved them so that they're prepared to hear the truth. It's not just about shouting truth in ever-louding volume, hurtling the truth at them. In the great musical Hamilton, about the beginnings of the American government and the revolution, the tension between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton in their competition, both being politicians, and Aaron Burr says to Hamilton, "You should talk less and smile more," and as a way of suggesting that he was going to play politics, and Hamilton took exception to that talk less and smile more. Hamilton was an assertive talker about his positions. But what we can learn from that tension as evaluators is to speak less and listen more, to develop the capacity to understand where intended users are coming from, where those in power are coming from, to figure out how to get the message to them. That's the jester skills, to be able to communicate in ways that can be heard, that are attuned to particular users, how they process information, and how they can learn from that information. In addition, we're not just speaking truth these days to the powerful, but we are a part of the larger battle about truth in a post-truth world. Soren Kierkegaard said there are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to believe what is true. And we live at a time when both kinds of foolishness are widespread. People who aren't believing what is true, people are refusing to believe what is true. And we are a part of that battle. The battle between facts, evidence, truth, data, reality, and thinking versus post-truth, fake news, alternative facts, make-believe, groupthink, and distortions. We are a part of this global, worldwide contention, not just speaking truth to power, but speaking truth to ordinary people, helping them learn to think evaluatively, to evaluate evidence, to be thoughtful. And we need to be able to engage as a part of that global battle. And so this April Fool's Day, I've shared with you 10 admonitions about how to be a jester without being foolish. Know and acknowledge what is not and cannot be known. Be modest. Realize that best practices aren't. Don't say statistically significant. Eschew fool's gold, the gold standard. Be thoughtful. Model evaluative thinking and build the capacity for evaluative thinking. Connect theory and practice. Be adaptable. Anticipate and address evaluation anxiety through learning, and speak truth to power and the masses as a skilled jester. I leave you then with April Fool's Day as a celebration of our patron saint, the jester, the trickster, the fool, who is indeed wise. The fool does think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool. We each in our own way have our own foolishnesses. This is an opportunity for us to reflect on in what ways are my own predispositions, my own assumptions, my own ways of operating potentially foolish, and not out of arrogance thinking that we've already figured it all out. I've been at this for 50 years. I'm still on the path of learning, and this for me is a chance to reflect on some of what I found is foolish in our profession, and to continue to think about how we as a profession generate wisdom. Thank you very much. I wish you a happy April Fool's Day.